We'll start where we left off. We're talking about, I've been told to speak a little slowly, I'll try. In case I've not put your hand up, I will again I'll try to speak slower. In case you want me to repeat anything, please tell me, I'm willing to do that. So we were we were looking at the two classifications of mathematics. We looked at epistemological and ontological and epistemological. We looked at the what is meant by the ontological aspect of mathematics. We moved on to the next slide. We looked at multiple examples in all the three texts that we are considering also. We move into the epistemological understanding of magical realism. Now we start off with again González Echeverría, who's an important critic of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He refers to the archive, which is Melquiades' room in the Bohemia house. The Bohemia house is a room which is dedicated to Melquiades, who's a wandering gypsy. Who comes every year and he stays with them, and he's the one who brings in these new ideas, the gypsies basically, and Melquiades sort of is spearheading the gypsies, the leader of the gypsies, so to speak. And Melquiades is the one we compare with Kitchen and Kunkaba, who live forever, who dies and comes back to life, etc. So he has this room which is termed as the archive by Echeverría, and he says this archive is interesting. Why? Because it actually draws attention to the visionary and the creative aspect of who Melquiades is. And the room is basically considered as a repository, as a place, as a space of Colombian and Latin American history. This archive is referred to as a place from where all these stories come from. Again, as I said, 100 Years of Solitude is a mega book, is a saga kind of thing. So it's also considered, what is interesting about 100 Years of Solitude. Again, OHYS is a reference to 100 Years of Solitude, in case anybody is wondering. OHYS is 100 Years of Solitude. I mentioned GT at places. GT is Govardhan's Travels, and Muziris is the saga of Muziris. So, Echeverría talks about Melquiades' room, which is termed as the archive, and he says that the room is basically a repository of Colombian and Latin American history, Latin American stories, etc., of the creative impulse that powers the Latin American fiction. And he says that this is, all of these, the chronicles and the 19th century myths and stories which come into which you find 100 Years of Solitude peppered with, come from this so-called repository. An archive becomes a metaphorical space for that. 100 Years of Solitude is actually dredging all these stories. An archive becomes a place from where you get it off. It becomes a metaphorical place for that. Now, Echeverría draws a metafictional panel. You know what metafictional is? When you're in fiction, when you're talking about the act of writing itself, that's what metafiction, right? You're talking about the act of creation itself, the act of writing itself. And this Melquiades' room, he says that the archive draws a metafictional parallel. Dipping into the archive, Marquez traces the modern American myth. You're creating a myth, so the 100 Years of Solitude becomes a myth, American myth itself, from which you can, from which stories fall out, right? So, modern American myth formulated the myths of modern society, the book, writing, reading. So 100 Years of Solitude is formulates, or the archive becomes the place into which archive or Melquiades' room, which is metafictionally the archive into which they delve into in order to bring out reading, writing, etc. I hope you understand. We look at this particular quote, I think it clarifies. So the archive is not so much an accumulation of texts. It's not merely the stories that you get there, but it's a process whereby the texts are written. The epistemological aspect of it, the irreverent aspect of it. You understand, right? Irreverent, why? Because it's challenging established notions of writing, established forms of writing, etc. So the archive is not just an accumulation of text. It's not merely some place where you take out all the text and you take out all the reading, etc. No, it's not that. But it's a process whereby texts are written. A process of repeated combinations of shufflings, reshufflings, ruled by heterogeneity and difference. You understand the metafictional aspect of it. So archive is not merely a place where you dig into to get your stories and tales and myths, etc. But it also, by virtue of the mixing and shuffling and reshuffling that you do, it becomes a place, it becomes a process of writing also. It's not strictly linear, as both continuity and discontinuity are held together in an uneasy alliance. I hope that is clear. So archive is, so you bring in the second part of it, or the epistemological aspect of it. You bring in the creative aspect of it. It's not merely a place where you begin for stories, but it also implies a manner of writing also. The process of writing also. So indicating self-reflexive and decolonizing shades of magical realism. So magical realism is this and that, both. Epistemological, so as a result of which Marquez's writing becomes both epistemological and ontological. So performance and expression of the archival is synthesized into present day fiction. So this performance of the archival, that's what happens in present day fiction, that's what happens in Govardhan's travels also. You see a replica of it which we'll see now, dredging the shifting contours of its own archive. So you are all, both Govardhan's travels, Anand and Govardhan's travels, as well as Sethu and Muziris, is also dredging a corresponding archive. Depending on the depth and breadth of the archive, they both are also dredging into a kind of an archive. Melchior's rule merely being a metaphorical thing for the archive that you're dredging into. So it's not merely stories, but it's also a process of narration. Why? Because you're mixing it, matching it, how you're doing it, etc., shuffling and reshuffling, etc. So all of them are digging into their own archive and availing of the historic, cultural and ideological specifics that you get from there. So there is an instance where Sethu traces a history of the spread of smallpox to India and how they call it as Achugutta. I don't know whether your parents or grandparents might know about it. There's something known as a process known as Achugutta, which was done to eradicate smallpox, and they used to hunt people and get it done. People used to run and hide. That's there in London Bacteria, London Bacteria also. So the mention of Sethu mentions smallpox in India, in the spread of smallpox in India, and again the spread of civilization, discovery of trade routes, etc. Again, he also is dredging into public and archival memory to trace multiple people and multiple stories. Anand again talks about Indian history and of multiple centuries, fictional texts, etc. Umrao Jan is a character in Anand's Govardhan Yatragal. From the Urdu novel Umrao Jan Ada, which was written by Mirza Hadi Ruswa in the 19th century. Again, finds mention in this particular text. Rubs shoulders with Harishchandra's Govardhan and other typical historical stories. So that's the archive that Anand digs into. Kumkum Sangari talks about 100 years of solitude. Kumkum Sangari is a very important, again, pretty important post-colonial critic who talks about 100 years of solitude and says that the play of linear time, there is two times mentioned, different kinds of times in 100 years of solitude. There is one linear time that you trace, the sixth generation of Govandiyas that you talk about, and then there is also a circular time. There are multiple times that you're talking about also. Which again, when you're studying these multiple time frames that you're using, you're again looking at the epistemological aspect of it, epistemological aspect of magical realism. You're looking at multiple ways of processes of narration, right? So there's no linear time is the predominant time, predominant manner of novel construction that has come down to us from Europe. But when you're using these time frames together, multiple time frames together, you're also telling a story or telling a lesson in how to narrate a story. You get it, right? So similarly, in 100 Years of Solitude, there is this two times they're talking about, linear time and circular time, which gets its strength by using magical realism, and because it generates different kinds of alignments, tensions, discontinuities between two kinds of time, sequential time and non-sequential time. So linear time talks about the historical consciousness of the author, the continent's colonial, pre-colonial, neo-colonial times. Circular time exists in an opposing relation with the linear time itself. Echeverria's two notions of time. There is one within the archive that you see and one outside the archive. The one within it is historical, and there is another one which is perceived by the characters, other characters. Other characters perceive a different time. There is one time and the other a circular time. It's a different circular repetitive time that seems to be perceived. So this flexibility, magical realism permits this kind of use of different time frames. As you see in Anand as well as in Sethu also, these different multiple time frames that are used actually gives you magical realism gives you the power to use that. Govardhan's Yatragal also, as we said, the multiple time frames that are used is aided by magical realism. You wouldn't be able to do it in a different framework probably. So in Govardhan's travels also you see this dual flow of time. The path in time placed by Govardhan in traversing time and space from which he is released. So Govardhan gets out of the prison in 1881 when he is released by the author Harishchandra, and then he travels through time to 21st century. That becomes a linear time in Govardhan's travels, which you see in 100 Years of Solitude also. But from prison till he finds himself subjected. Apparently in the last bit, he's caught in a terrorist act. It's a modern day setup wherein he's hiding from bullets, which might attack him. That is what the text sort of ends in 21st century. A terrorist attack or something of the sort. So that is the linear time. Govardhan's travels, specifically travel itself is the linear time. But again, there is the other multiple time frames that sort of punctuate the linear time. That mentioned in with respect to Echeverria mentioned with respect to 100 Days of Solitude also. There is a linear time, and then there is another time perceived by the other characters. So there in the other time, which is not the linear time, you have these multiple people of multiple personages and historical and fictional personages who enter into Govardhan's life. He travels through the Mughal time. He meets Galileo. He meets Kepler. So all of that are the multiple time frames that we're talking about. I hope that's clear. So when we are telling about these time frames, you are not merely telling the tale, you are telling how to narrate the story also. So when you're using these multiple time frames, so that becomes the epistemological magical realism that we talked about, right? So which you see in Govardhan's travels also. So Anand also creates dizzyingly transforming time frames which blend and clash, where individuals and incidents across time spans and geographical and fictional spaces intersect. So similarly, again, what is interesting is that in 100 Days of Solitude, towards the end of the text, the last Aurelian of Babylonia, who was hidden away, he sort of finds there's a code, there's a parchment which he decodes, which was in Sanskrit apparently, and he decodes that, and that when he decodes the transcript, it actually tells the story of the Buendias, and he understands that he's going to be swept away. That the Buendias and the house is going to be swept away. He realizes that. So he cracks the code, he decodes the language and he reads his history, and that is when that's the act of reading itself. Again, the epistemological aspect coming in, right? So the act of reading itself, and he dies at the end. He knows that he's going to die as he reads it, and metaphorically, something like the death of the author or the birth of a reader suggested out there. So Aurelianus' death, which is metaphorically the death of the author, only to be born again as a reader to read the text anew, leading to the merging of embedded and implied readers. So the suggestion of the reader coming out there. So what we talked about is a faith-based reading facilitates a non-Western view. Faith-based reading is the ontological view. The Malayalam text again attempt to. I hope it's clear. I'm trying to connect with the Latin American text with the Malayalam text. The Malayalam text also, there's a lot of this recovery of micro-narratives, history, culture, subjectivities, etc. Using these conflating time periods, smoothing over individual characters, and tell the story of not of an individual but of a community, which we talked about right at the beginning. You find that in both the Malayalam writers as well as in 100 Days of Solitude, you have this, not really telling the tale of an individual, but you're telling the tale of a community. You find that in Govardhan's travels as well as in Saga of Muziris. Even when each of them are all personal tale, it's much larger than a personal tale. You are telling the tale of a community, of a society, of a nation, etc. So Sethu similarly, subverts this notion of time when he he's subverting the notion of historical fiction when he's again highly self-reflexive. He again, talks about what constitutes fiction. The novel, as I said, is autoethnographic, and the construct of the history is fluid. It's not necessarily the scientific construct that we talked about. A lot of freedom for the novelist and the reader suggested. Anand in the prologue says, the metafictional intent that we talked about, Anand says, in the prologue to the text, he says, walking this path, I do not remember exactly when I arrived at Marquez' Andhir Nagari, thus building the frame of his work. So the frame of the work, again, suggesting that I am writing, the claiming of the author to be who he is. So in his epilogue, he also says, in a Barthesian, Roland Barthes kind of a statement, he says that no literary work is a compact body, nor is reading a slavish action imposed on the reader by an autocratic writer. A finished work is a collection of many pieces of work, and reading is a flexible activity that's free to take off from the work at any point and slip into something else. A work that is good is one which inspires the reader to do this, and a good reader is one who is able to take off and slip away in this manner. This is by Anand in his epilogue to the text. He talks about privileging the reader and not the, I do not have to find the word, not necessarily, but the reader, privileging the reader. I hope that's clear, right? Is it clear? This is again, so what I'm saying is that magical realism is permitting, is promoting metafictionality and privileging the reader, the textualization of the reader being important. Magic realism by its format enables and gives power, empowers the reader to do that, is what we are suggesting. There's a critic by the name John Thiem. I don't think I mentioned him. John Thiem, Jonthien. He says that, I'll read that, that's interesting and relevant to the textualization of the reader. The great tradition of past writing puts the postmodern writer into the position of a reader who may be thrilled by the riches of the past or feel overwhelmed by their authority. In the reader, the postmodern writer has found an ideal figure through which to explore the splendors and miseries of belatedness. And he also says, he talks about the textualization of the reader, and he says the textualization takes place where the world of a text literally intrudes the extra-textual or the reader's world. So that's when textualization of the reader takes place. How the reader is empowered, reader is free to make his own interpretation, his own reading. Reader is called into the process of making the text, which we have learned as reader responsibilities and the stuff. So yes, with this we move on to the next slide. Next slide, which again is connected to the previous slide, as we said. One of the important features, one of the important tropes, so to speak, which you find in a lot of Latin American writing is the trope of the labyrinth. The trope of the labyrinth. Labyrinth as in the maze, so to speak. Labyrinth again suggests, say for example, Gabriel Garcia Marquez has written the text General in his Labyrinth. General in his Labyrinth, which talks about Simon Bolivar. Simon Bolivar's last 28 days or something like that. Last 1 month or something like that. Of Simon Bolivar. Simon Bolivar was the great father of Latin America. So Labyrinth basically again is a repeated trope that you find in Latin American writing. So we are looking at Labyrinth, or again in the last page of 100 Years of Solitude, he says that he describes Macondo as a city of mirrors, city of mirages, and it has to come down. It's a very powerful last page. I do not have the text with me, I can't read it out. Very powerful last bit where he talks about the fact that, again, he talks about metafictionality also. I do not have the text, so I can't quote it. So when he talks about the mirror coming crashing, the city coming crashing down, etc. Labyrinth and this aspect we talk about repetition. Labyrinth as a repetitive, labyrinth as a means of a kind of a repetition, labyrinth or the maze. Similarly, a hall of mirrors, the idea of a hall of mirrors. So what we are doing is we are trying to connect the two, and also connect the fact that there's a lot of repetition that you find in 100 Days of Solitude, and you find in the other texts too. And that is a repeated things, repeated names. For example, the sixth generation of the Buendias, you find the names repeated. The boys are named Arcadio or Jose Arcadio or Aureliano, right? So it's either of these two names, and Arcadio is a kind of character, and Aureliano is a brooding kind, and Arcadio is this physical, active kind of a person. So you're building this, and every year there are these boys who are born and who are named Arcadio, Jose Arcadio or Aureliano, which is a kind of a repetition. You have the repetitive pattern that you see. So labyrinth or the mirrors, etc., that you keep constantly coming through in Latin American writing, recurrently you see. Again, like Bolivar's labyrinth, or even Scheherazad's 1001 Nights, wherein you have a repetition that you see. Every night a new story. You see the repetition, a pattern which keeps recurring. So that metaphor, the metaphor of the labyrinth, it's not metaphor of the labyrinth or the mirror. That's not that again suggests an infinitude. Infinitude or multiplicity or never-ending kind of a quality to it. Labyrinth again suggests that, the mirrors again suggest that, like mirrors reflect, they keep reflecting. So that quality, the repetitive quality, that again is interesting. Why? Because it talks about endless tales, endless stories, endless readings. Again, which takes us back to the previous slide that we were talking about, the repetitive, the endless reading, endless, the implied reader and possibility of many readings that we talk about, metafiction, textualization of reader. So that labyrinth element is a very interesting aspect too. So yes, repetition is a technique, and that's used by all three of the writers, Marquez, Sethu and Anand. All of them use this repetitive quality, and it suggests an infinitude, endlessness, a never-ending quality to it. And you have repetition, you have reversal, repetition of names, repetition of incidents, characters repeated, And that again suggests the Jungian idea. I'm presuming you are aware of Carl Jung. Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, as different from Freud's idea of the individual unconscious, Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, which we were talking about earlier too. You know, the Latin American writing talks about the collective, about the society, about the people, rather than about the individual. So these repetitions or these labyrinthine quality or these mirrors, the plot mirroring that you see, talks about the repetitions that we are talking about, right? Talks about the infinitude, the collective unconscious, collective rather than the individual, opposed Jung versus Freud kind of thing. So repetition is actually a narrative principle within magical realism. Magical realism uses repetition very often, analogs structurally or symbolically used to create shifting references. You find that in magical realism text. Mirroring or repetition. Marquez and Anand actually uses mirrors. Both Anand as well as Anand in his Govardhan's travels, as well as this gentleman in 100 Days of Solitude, use the trope of mirrors. Mirrors, literally mirrors, and they use for multiple manners. So and even the fact that you are repeating names like Arcadio and Aureliano who repeat themselves, etc., that itself creates a mirroring effect. You know, a mirroring effect, because it is reflecting again and again. So yes. Plot mirroring, that is termed as plot mirroring or repetition, which is actually Wendy Faris says that they are repeated elements various times, both intratextual and intertextual, create a narrative hall of mirrors. It has a mirroring effect that we say. It is part of the revisionist agenda of magical realism, right? Revisionist, you're questioning, you're challenging, you're revising established norms. So using of mirrors suits the revisionist agenda of magical realism. Reversals can come across like characters changing places or names, etc. All of that can. And again, what does revisions or revisals do? They actually question established patterns of history, established patterns of, you know, there's no one history, there are multiple ways of telling the same thing. That is suggested again by repetition. They talk about lack of human control over events. We probably cannot control it, etc. So again, they mix the living and the dead. You don't know, you know, say for example, Melchiades dies and comes back, or Kungan, Kitchen and Kungama, transform from one age to the they move from one place to the one time to the other. So that kind of a shifting happens both in the Malayalam literature as well as in 100 Days of Solitude. So Govindias become the ciphers of collective unconscious related to each other, less by family history rather than a mythic paradigm. So they are connected to each other. There's a collective element to it. You can't really distinguish. Say for example, in earlier traditional novels, you would find that a character is important for the character. So it is not like that. You are looking at a collection of people who mean something or stand for something. So death in life, life and death, etc. phenomenon, also is part of the repetition that we talk about. You find in again, Gabriel in its Labyrinth, which is another important text by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, wherein you look at Simon Bolivar at many times as almost a death-like, mythic, almost corpse-like figure. So death and life being sort of interchangeably existent, simultaneously being existent. So it has been used again as I said, it's a double, Macondo is a double vision space. It's called a city of mirrors or mirages. Macondo itself is called a city of mirrors or mirages. And towards the end it comes crashing down. And when it comes crashing down, what happens when a mirror crashes? You have many more images coming up, right? Multiple images or multiple versions that come up. I hope that is clear. When a city of mirrors comes crashing down, you have that many more mirrors, that many more reflections sort of created. So that is what happened in 100 Days of Solitude. It comes down, crashing down, revising multiple visions the narrative affords. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the use of mirrors in order to tell that there are many more stories to be told. Like this is, 100 Days of Solitude is one. There are many more stories which can be told, which can be read, which can be narrated, etc. So mirrors standing for that. Again, this is connected to the previous slide that we talked about, the epistemological aspect of it. So again, as I said, last Aureliano, when he reads it, he feels as though he was looking into a speaking mirror. Again, in Govardhan's travels, if you're familiar with Govardhan Yatragal, there is a Dwarapalaga who is, and there's a scene where there's a room of mirrors, and it comes down because of inequality and injustice. The mirror comes crashing down, Govardhan's travels, again opening up multiple visions. The inequality, injustice, again suggesting, you're looking at a unitary view and you're trying to impose a unitary view. So when that comes crashing down, the mirror, hall of mirror, where the authorities sit, when it comes crashing down, you again have multiple views thrown up, that there are multiple voices, multiple people and multiple narrations that can be mentioned. So similarly, these again, Govardhan's travels, reflect what was told in 100 Years of Solitude, the idea of mirrors, the idea of repetition. So this palace of mirrors, similarly there's a palace of mirrors built in Kalika Bagh in Govardhan's travels. Rani Kamla Devi, another character, who talks about the loyalty of mirrors, as in the mirrors are loyal companions, she says. And then Amir Khusru, who's also there in Govardhan's travels, he counters Kamla Devi and says, their loyalty can cross all limits and turn into disloyalty when they start to reflect the images of what we wish to be rather than of who we really are. So again suggesting multiplicities, right? So Amir Khusru challenges the loyalty of mirrors and says that there can be multiple versions of it. And that is when you hear, the multiple versions of the thing. So in the course of the conversation, the mirror cracks and comes down, and you hear of some kind of a trouble brewing outside between the Britishers and Indian soldiers, and the reference being to the 1857 battle. So Anand again brings in two time frames, as we know. So, they have to step out of the palace of mirrors that they are trapped in, etc. So I think we can mention this. Then similarly in Govardhan's travels, there's a mention of Janus, reference to Janus from whose name January, the month January takes its name, because it's looking in two directions. That's why January is called. January is after god Janus. So there's a reference to Janus in Govardhan's travels, the Roman god of the door, the two faces. And again, there's a reference to Ashtadikpalikas, again, who look at different directions and different perspectives, different views and different versions, who guard 8 directions in addition to the gods of doors and in the Indian mythology. The Dikpalikas guard directions that change according to where we stand, again suggesting multiple views, metafictional pointer to multiple possible narrative possibilities. So similarly, just like Aureliano and Arcadio, the names are repeating in 100 Years of Solitude, there are these two characters, and there is one more character in Govardhan, they are by the name Alidos. The Alidos and Govardhan, they are supposed to be brothers, right? And sometimes these characters keep shifting. You don't know who was Alidos and who was. Alidos is an evil figure, mostly. So you have these again, mostly, not purely. So you have these figures shifting and you don't know who is who. There is a mixing of Arcadio and Aureliano, two brothers, which happens in 100 Years of Solitude. And generally, because of the mixing, they name them differently. Aureliano is a calm one and Arcadio is the physical one. But then the names get interchanged in one generation. So a similar thing happens in Govardhan's travels too. Alidos and those that Govardhan who are brothers who merge. In some places there is this one person who's both the people. So those kind of usages in Govardhan's travels. Similarly in Saga of Business, as I said, it's Pichen and Kunkama who travels through time. And so that defocalized narrative again questions time, space, subjectivity, etc. We move on to the next. So we look at magical realism as I think I've actually covered a whole lot of it. I'll just how magical realism is a decolonizing project. How it's used as a decolonizing project. We've actually looked at a whole lot of it. I briefly discuss a couple of quotes and then we can move on. So post-colonialism again it can be treated as it's treated as part of post-colonialism, and Brenda Cooper talks about, it's not there, Brenda Cooper talks about the hybrid nature of magical realism, and magical realism opposes fundamentalism and purity. It doesn't question these unitary versions of things, fundamentalism and purity. It's at odds with racism, ethnicity, and the quest for taproots, origins, and homogeneity. It's fiercely secular and revels in the body, joker, laughter, liminality, and the profane. So it becomes all of that. I'll repeat that quote. Magical realism opposes fundamentalism and purity. It's at odds with racism, ethnicity, and the quest for taproots. Taproots is the one big root, right? Taproots, origins, and homogeneity. It's fiercely secular and revels in the body, the joker, the laughter, the liminality that Baba was talking about, and the profane. Magical realism focuses on those areas, is what Brenda Cooper says. Similarly, a couple of quotes that I'll wind up this bit. Michael Dash's quote is interesting. He says that it constitutes a counterculture of imagination, and it integrates elements of local folk culture in order to engage in a conception of a past which would shatter myth of historylessness or non-achievement. So it's giving space to people who are, faceless or without history, or people who have not been named, people who have not been, written about, who don't have a narrative about them. So it's giving faces and representations for those kind of spaces is what we talk about. Another quote which again is not there, but which is interesting, is Alec Boehmer says, since Rushdie's first attempts to open up magical realism, there are others like Amitav Ghosh, Ben Okri, Inji Vasanji, who have actually borrowed extensively from Latin American magical realism. There is no mention of Malayalam writers in the platform, in the quotes, the critics that we have talked about, because we have had not many translations, even though we have received a whole lot of translations from other, say Czech and Russian and Latin American, etc. The translations from Malayalam to the other languages is pretty new. Govardhan's travels happened about 10 years earlier, the translation. The translation is few and far between, and the quality of all those translations is not exactly the best. Govardhan's travels is excellent, but Saga of Muziris leaves a lot to be desired. So as a result, because there's not a lot of study that has been undertaken. It's not really known. That's the same for all regional languages. There's a lot of wealth of literature that's happening in Malayalam and Tamil and all the other languages. It's not really finding the space in the sun that it should. Right? So probably that is the reason why those names don't figure here in these critics when they talk about Amitav Ghosh and Ben Okri and all of them. They are much more approachable, they are much more available to, whereas our writers, unfairly enough, do not have that kind of platform. There's a lot of work which needs to be done in that area. So, what he says is that Alec Boehmer is saying that all of these writers are actually borrowed from, they're all current writers, like they're writing now. Amitav Ghosh again is another very interesting writer who uses magical realism, who have borrowed from Latin American writing, adapting and embellishing its techniques for their own particular needs. And that's what our writers have also done, like Sethu and Anand also have attempted to do. That's what I'm trying to talk about. So that is again interesting. So this is interesting. This quote by Wendy Faris, I think we should talk about. Wendy Faris talks about the fact that magical realist writing is post-realist writing, as in it's writing after realism, after the time of realism, which again was a European format. Post-realist writing, post-nativist politics, a transnational rather than national solidarity, and pessimism, a kind of optimism, post-optimism, a post that challenges earlier legitimizing narrative. So it's also interesting that from magical realism is not really Latin American writers don't go back to magic, don't write a lot of writing in magical realism. They moved into a documentary realism, even including Gabriel, Garcia, Marquez and others. They moved into a documentary realist style of writing, as you see in Anand and Sethu's writing also. The movement towards a documentary realism, moving away from magical realism that you see in Anand and Sethu's writing too. That's the last bit, which again is I believe that's not a very complete slide, but it talks about why magical realism is received better in certain communities rather than certain other communities. Again, going back to what we talked about, the influence of magical realism in Kerala, what would be the possible reasons? It's a really introductory thing. I've not done a lot of work in that. We're talking about reception of magical realism, how magical realism has been received. There are some factors, there are certain reasons and factors because of which magical realism gets accepted. Reception theory probably talks about, say, social, economic, political, cultural factors probably are the reasons why certain kinds of movements find better acceptance in certain communities. These might be the reasons. And we are trying to club it with why it has been accepted in Malayalam, in our literature, in our culture, etc. Reception aesthetics will be altered by all of these factors. Faris, as Wendy Faris talks about, the contemporary Western reader's primary doubt is most often between understanding an event as a character's dream or hallucination, and alternatively understanding it as a miracle. So this particular what magical realists or Latin Americans treat as miracle or treat as something more than normal, which would sound as though magical to a Western reader, might be accepted better in our communities which have been in our cultures and our literature, which has been largely oral, largely mythical, largely, a lot of things we accept as normal probably than say a Western, a purely Western notion of culture. So that's the reason probably Western reader might have had trouble with magical realism because, or what is magical, or what is, because of the fact that how do you understand it? Is it a character's dream, or is it a hallucination, or is it a miracle? How do you deal with that kind of thing? So as a result of which, what we are suggesting here is that in cultures wherein there is active traditions of orality, oral literature, oral narratives, or alternate belief systems, alternate ways of looking at things. Say for example, multiple ways wherein we don't fit in with for example, the fact that we speak multiple languages. Any Indian speaks 2 or 3 languages. The fact that you have access to multiple literatures and multiple belief systems or multiple cultures itself makes us more open probably to magical realism as a form of narrative, because of the fact that there are active traditions of literature, life, alternate belief systems, ancient myths which are part of our contemporary life. It's not like say we live those myths and we are part of those myths, or say for example the myths of Mahabharata, Ramayana, etc. We consider it as a community, we consider it as a religion, whereas the Greek myths, etc. they're just myths, there's no religion evolving out of it. It used to be a practiced religion. So as a result of which, those kind of aspects probably might be the reason why it found greater acceptance in India and in Kerala specifically, and probably that's the reason that is attested by multiple cultures, say for example the Native American cultures, or African cultures, or South Asian cultures where magical realism has been accepted. Probably that's the reason why Latin American writing has had a huge influence on Malayalam writing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. We'll invite your questions for the Q&A session now. Please ask your questions to Ms. Priya Joseph now.
He talks about magical realism and how Malayalam films have been influenced by magical realism. His films, his writing, his work has been influenced by magical realism. You're familiar with him, I'm sure. So it's a very commonly accepted. Any questions, any doubts, anything you want me to clarify?
Ma'am, I'm Lakshman, yes. I'm a second year MA English student. Ma'am, I already told you that I'm an MA English student, right? But even as an English student, we are really into magical realism because we only have Summer Midnight Children and Gabriel, Marquez, the 100 years old. These are only the texts we study in BA classes, and we always get 2 textbooks. One is 2 marks, which is define what is magical realism. The other one is for 50 marks. Write an essay on magical universal elements in Midnight Children. As an English student, we only know magical realism as a combination or a mixture of reality and fiction. Nothing other than that. When we talk about magical realism as an ontological meaning, I was thinking that I began to remember some of the classes I learned in my BA classes. Even in Summer Street's Midnight Children, that's one of the scenes that I learned that it is a magical realism scene. But when I think about, I thought that it is a magical realism which is talk about post-colonialism. The scene is simple. A doctor is treating a woman, and that woman and a doctor is separated by a cloth. And there is a hole in it, and the doctor is treating that woman through that hole. And the magical here is that hole is represented as a two side of British or India or Pakistan or India. So as a I already learned 200 years of years of solitude, and we also have 15 marks essay question for that. I also attended it, and most of the students are BA students, first years, and they have to learn 100 years of solitude.
It's prescribed to be 100 years of solitude.
Yeah, they have.
That's fun.
They have to read it. So they also, I told you that they also get magic elements in 100 years of solitude. And you already told that banana massacre in that. So, and there's also some of the magic elements in it. If you tell me some of the magical elements in 100 years of solitude, this benefit for students as well as when we, ma'am, yeah, I want to tell you that magical is alien to us, right? If you, talk with example from work, like you already did, it's very beneficial for us.
What are the magical elements in magical elements text?
100 years of
in 100 years of solitude. I'm talking from memory. I do not have the text with me.
No, you need to only explain things you know.
Okay, so now even when a question like explain the magical aspects, elements in 100 years of solitude, what I was trying to say is that the magical elements are pretty out there. It is clear. It's say the priest who levitates, priest who goes up, or Remedios the beauty who's taken up. Mauricio Babylonia was followed by butterflies, if you remember. Mauricio Babylonia, right? Mauricio Babylonia was followed by yellow butterflies wherever he goes. The last child was born with a pig's tail, if you remember. So all of those are, or young Aurelian who looks at a cup and the cup sort of moves to the edge of the table and it falls. He just looks at it, So those kind of things are the magical elements. What I'm suggesting is that even when a question like talk about the magical elements, it calls for more than that. Even if your question is merely talk about magical elements of a magical realist text, as a postgraduate student, you should not be only talking about magical elements. You should be talking about much more than that. Right? Magical elements are pretty clear. If you go through the text, it all jumps out. There's no missing in 100 years of solitude the magical elements.
Ma'am, I also heard that at that time there are censorship. So Marquez has to write indirectly some of the instance in his work.
Probably that could be, but censorship not the kind. Apparently, what's also interesting is that the Spanish Inquisition that we talked about in the early years, right, and during when they were under Spain, and at the time there were no books available. They used to bring books under wine, you had wine barrels, and there would be this small pocket underneath, not pocket. They would insert books there and they would bring. That's how they read Don Quixote and the rest of it. It was during that time. Marquez may have used, but Marquez actually talks about banana massacre as merely one incident. There are multiple other incidents. Civil War, Jamie Uribe, if you know, again was a representative of an actual dictator, etc. There are these multiple instances which are historical, which are ontological, as we say. There are multiple instances, I would say. Magical are very evident. You just go through the text and you get all the magical elements. Some of these are what I mentioned. I'm not claiming that I mentioned all.
It's fine, it's really helpful. Thank you so much.
George. Ramayana Mahabharata was oral literature for a long time. So it was written down much later. It is said that, before answering your question, it is said that, you must have heard of this, Iravati Karve's Yuganta, which is a version of Ramayana from Draupadi's perspective, similar to Palace of Illusions, Chitrabayana's Jideva Karvani. So apparently in Iravati Karve's text, Yuganta is titled, it's a play, In the introductory part, there is a writing where she talks about how Ramayana and Mahabharata changed its narrative from time to time. So which area, which time it was written. So for example, the Draupadi's Vastraharan, etc. Or the status of women, which is not exactly the best in the Vedas, etc. As mentioned, and etc. came about as a result of the influence of the Vedas and what is said in the Vedas, etc. So those aspects where Draupadi was shamed in a courtroom, etc., came in because of that. So it is not sacrosanct, just like any of these texts, religious or otherwise. They probably are not sacrosanct. They have changed under multiple pressures, which happened at multiple times. Now, are there magical realist elements? Probably you can read from a magical realist perspective. Probably you can undertake a so yes, probably you can. But again, magical realism was definitely not a term that Valmiki or Vyas was thinking about. Probably you can. But they have undergone changes. That's something we need to, again, can be subjected very much to a political meaning. They've undergone changes and there are versions of Ramayana wherein Ram and Lakshman, etc. are depicted as Adivasis. In, I think, Andhra Pradesh or somewhere, where they have versions wherein Ram and Lakshman are depicted as Adivasis. So again, there is this, in Amar Chitra Kathas, if you see, the Ravanas, the Rakshasas are depicted as black skin, and the Devas are all white skins. So again, probably the Aryan Dravidian thing, So they were all pushed south. We are all blessed.